Radiation Society at Griffith University, previously head of the School of Science there, adjunct professor of other universities, awarded the Eureka Prize for Promotion of Science, Prime Minister's Environment Award for Outstanding Individual Achievement, member of the National Energy Research Development and Demonstration Council, director of the Commission for the Future, a member of the Radiation Health and Safety Advisory Council. He's appeared on UNESCO boards, or delegations rather, and was part of the Expert Advisory Committee for the Nuclear Fuel Cycle Royal Commission in South Australia, etc. CV you couldn't jump over. Welcome to the show, Professor.
Thanks, Peter. I feel tired just listening to that.
Exactly. You were recently in Adelaide giving a speech about your new book, which is called Long Half-Life, the Nuclear Industry in Australia.
Correct. And I chose the title because the half-life of a radioactive material is the time it takes to decline by radioactive decay to half its original mass. And the half-life of the most common form of uranium, uranium-238, is about 4.5 billion years, which is about as long as the Earth's existed. And I make the point that the half-life of politicians is more like 4.5 years than 4.5 billion years. So there's a tremendous mismatch between the time horizon of our decision makers and the time horizon of the decisions they're making about nuclear matters.
Such as the dump in Kimber?
Yes, indeed. And the fact that basically since we established the research reactor at Lucas Heights in the 1950s, we've been producing radioactive waste, and only now, nearly 70 years later, are we thinking about, well, we need to find some way of storing radioactive waste that needs to keep it out of harm's way, or keep it away from harming humans and other parts of the biosphere for incredibly long periods. And it's a problem that's writ large around the world, because there are over 400 large nuclear reactors generating electricity, and in most countries there isn't even a strategy for thinking about a process for managing the waste, which needs to be kept out of the biosphere for geological time, hundreds of thousands of years.
Do we need nuclear power, Professor?
Well, we certainly don't in Australia. You could make a case that countries that have gone heavily for nuclear power, like France is the extreme case for a whole set of political and social reasons that happened in the 1960s and the 1970s. And France still gets about 70% of its electricity from nuclear power. So it's impossible to imagine them doing without it on a timescale of less than a few decades. But the countries that don't have nuclear power, like Australia and New Zealand and Norway, there's simply no case at all for nuclear electricity. There was an argument 10 years ago. Professor Barry Brook of the University of Adelaide and I wrote a so-called flip book. It didn't have a back cover, it had two front covers. And on one side he gave the case for Australia developing nuclear electricity, and on the other side I gave the case against. And at that time, nuclear electricity was less expensive than the large-scale renewables like solar farms and wind turbines. And so there was an argument that it might have been cheaper in principle to invest in nuclear reactors rather than solar and wind. What's happened since then has been a dramatic reduction in the price. 10 years ago, the average price of electricity from solar panels was about 35 cents a kilowatt hour. Last year, globally, it was 3.7 cents.
Wow.
And similarly, wind's come down in the last decade from about 14 cents a kilowatt hour to about 4. And the most optimistic estimates of what electricity from nuclear reactors would be is in the region of 12 to 16. So it's not a bit more expensive. It's 3 or 4 times the price of electricity from solar farms or wind turbines.
We've been constantly told by the proponents of the nuclear dump, nuclear waste repository in Kimber, that it's only low-level waste that they'll be storing. Is this true? And that we won't take foreign nuclear waste? How do we know, Professor?
Well, we don't. Basically, people in Kimber have been told that it will only be for low-level waste, and low-level waste is comparatively benign. They're things like lab coats and gloves that have been used in nuclear medicine, and so they're not deadly, and you wouldn't really worry about a terrorist getting their hands on an old lab coat because they can't do much damage with it. But there was a throwaway line by the minister that suggested that they might want to use that site also for intermediate level waste, which is being produced at Lucas Heights, and that would be of rather more concern, I think, because that is quite nasty stuff. There's a real issue there in New South Wales, because the New South Wales Parliament at different times has said, on the one hand, that it doesn't want intermediate level waste stored permanently at Lucas Heights, but they've also said that they don't approve of waste being carried on the transport system of the sovereign state of New South Wales. So they don't want it either to stay there or to be moved, which just shows how politicians think through these issues.
Well, it's about to be trundled through New South Wales and indeed South Australia, isn't it, in vast volume? And how do we guarantee, do we take politicians' words, take them at their word when they say, that we'll never import waste from other countries? But that can change, can't it?
Oh, it can. I mean, at the moment, it would be illegal under Australian law to import radioactive waste, but laws can be changed, new laws can be passed. But in fact, the Morrison government conducted an inquiry last year. The House of Representatives committee was invited to report on the legal obstacles to the nuclear industry in Australia. And one of the majority recommendations was that they believed that it didn't make sense to continue the legal prohibition on nuclear power stations. They argued that they should stand or fall on their economic merit rather than there being a legal prohibition. But I haven't noticed any great enthusiasm among elected politicians for changing the law to make it possible to build nuclear power stations.
What of the nuclear submarines that we were about to have built in South Australia? What's your view on that, Professor?
Well, I think, I may be proven wrong, but I'd be prepared to have a side wager that this will turn out to have been simply a pre-election stunt, because historically the US military have been remarkably reluctant to share their nuclear technology, even with their closest allies. And all that's been agreed at the moment is an 18-month period of discussion about the practicality of acquiring US or British nuclear submarines. I won't be at all surprised if it turns out to be too difficult and we finish up retrofitting the Collins-class submarines to prolong their life a bit longer, particularly as Professor Hugh White has argued that nuclear submarines just don't make any sense in terms of defending Australia, because what you need to defend our northern coastline is submarines that can operate in relatively shallow water. And that is not what nuclear submarines are about. What
is the danger here to South Australians, if any, Professor?
Well, it depends what is done. I mean, if we bought American submarines sort of off the peg, so to speak, one of the arguments I've heard is that they'd come with a sealed nuclear reactor unit which would last the life of the submarine, and so there wouldn't be any nuclear technology jobs in South Australia. But that seems unlikely to me. I mean, at the moment, New Zealand doesn't allow nuclear-powered or armed ships into its waters. So it would certainly restrict our military cooperation with our closest neighbour and nearest ally if we were to engage in nuclear submarines.
As part of the ANZUS Treaty, which includes New Zealand, of course.
Yes, yes. And, of course, the real concern, I think, is that it locks us into being part of the American nuclear military machine. And one observer said that it would have the effect of making us a nuclear target. If I remember during the height of the Cold War, some defence analysts said that if the Russians were really upset with the Americans, they wouldn't dare launch a nuclear attack on the US because that would invite massive retaliation. But they might show the Americans how upset they were by launching a small attack against one of their allies, like Australia. And you could imagine a similar argument that China wouldn't risk having a nuclear war with the United States of America. But if China was really unhappy with the United States, they might want to make an example of one of the Americans' allies. And certainly if there were ever a serious conflict, the so-called joint facilities like Pine Gap are such an integral part of the US military machine that they would be obvious targets.
Emeritus Professor Ian Lowe, my guest here, talking about nuclear perspectives. This is you do all this, you know, as the scientist you are, the eminent scientist, very rationally. What about this is meant to be a bonanza for jobs? Similarly, the dump in Kimber is meant to be a bonanza for jobs. Rowan Ramsey, the federal member there, has always touted that. Is this true, Ian?
The short answer is no. I mean, historically, there have been all sorts of overblown promises about the jobs and the revenue from getting involved in the nuclear industry. But in my book, I remind people that the inquiry set up by the Whitlam government into the Ranger project in the 1970s said that exporting uranium would probably be profitable, but its overall economic impact would be limited and it would provide relatively few jobs. And that has indeed been the case. In fact, most people were surprised when I pointed out to them that the revenue from exporting uranium is comparable with such minor minerals as tin and tantalum. And in fact, Australia makes more money exporting cheese than we do exporting uranium. And this is contrasted with the overblown headlines. I remember in the 1970s, the commercial media said we would be the Saudi Arabia of the Southern Hemisphere, wallowing in the wealth that would be produced by exporting uranium. And in fact, it's a relatively trivial industry economically. And similarly, I note in the book that there was a people's inquiry into the uranium export industry in South Australia about 20 years ago. And it noted that the royalties paid to the government from uranium exports were a few % of what had been projected when then Western Mining was opening up the Olympic Dam project. There was talk of, hundreds of millions of dollars of royalties, and that has never materialised. So I think that any promises of huge amounts of money from involvement in the nuclear industry should be taken not with a grain of salt, but with a salt cellar.
Emeritus Professor Ian Lowe, what about the sense that that Kimber, for example, has been bribed by the federal government, as many opponents of the dump there have said? There seem to be rivers of gold in Kimber at the moment.
Well, certainly it's not unreasonable if people sort of take one for the team that they get some compensation. I mean, this is I've seen this argued quite reasonably in the two countries that are well advanced with the process for managing radioactive waste are Finland and Sweden.
Mm-hmm.
And in both cases, the government there has said, quite reasonably, nobody particularly wants to have radioactive waste in their backyard.
Mm-hmm.
If one community agrees to bear the national burden, then it's reasonable for the other parts of the country that don't want it to compensate them.
Mm.
And so, giving the community of Kimber some financial compensation for accepting the country's radioactive waste, I think that's quite a reasonable principle.
An inducement.
Yes. It's probably a more responsible use of public money than, I don't know, building railway station car parks in places where there aren't railway stations, to pick an example purely at random.
And what do you think, because you've worked on climate change, Professor, what do you think of the current issue that we've got with the Prime Minister going to Glasgow with targets which will not be appealing to the world?
Well, we have a bad reputation. I mean, I was on the Australian delegation to the Geneva conference. I was an observer at Kyoto. I was an observer at Copenhagen. And Australia is seen internationally as a country that contributes well above its weight to the problem and is not doing its fair share of doing something about it. And I think that will be reinforced if we go to Glasgow with either no target at all or a target that's seen as grossly inadequate. I mean, I make the comparison that the international climate science community ranks countries' promises to do something about it as to whether they're adequate, inadequate, grossly inadequate. One of the countries that is ranked as inadequate is Germany. Germany's commitment is a 65% reduction by 2030. And that's seen as inadequate because the argument is that as a developed country that uses a lot of energy and has historically produced a lot of carbon dioxide and put it in the atmosphere, they should be reducing by more like 75%. And the idea that we could think of as a credible response to say we'll reduce by 26 to 28% by 2030, I mean, it will simply not be credible on the world stage.
But why? This is the question that haunts us, I think, Professor. Why are you and other scientists not listened to, whereas 11 National Party MPs and senators are?
Well, that's a very good question. And, why is a government talking about a gas-led recovery when the climate science has been saying for decades that gas is not as bad a part of the problem as coal? But we've, in fact, the International Energy Agency has said that a target of net zero emissions by 2050 means no new coal mines, no new coal-fired power stations, no new oil fields, no new gas fields anywhere ever. So it's simply dishonest to say that we accept the principle of net zero emissions, but we're going to open new gas fields.
And the National Party wants a subsidy for a coal train somewhere.
Yes. I mean, it doesn't even make economic sense because the world is moving away from coal. I was looking at figures for new electricity capacity commissioned in the world last year. And last year, the world commissioned 192 gigawatts, 192,000 megawatts of new renewables. And to put in perspective, Australia's total electricity capacity is about 40 gigawatts. So the world commissioned about 5 Australia's worth of new renewables, solar, wind and hydro. they commissioned about 40 gigawatts of gas-fired electricity. Would you like to guess how much coal-fired electricity was commissioned last year?
None.
Well, it's actually less than that. Yes, there were new coal-fired power stations coming online, but the amount of old capacity that was decommissioned was greater than the amount of new coal capacity coming online. And the reason is cold hard economics, that the price of electricity from solar farms and wind turbines is now less than the running costs of old power stations that have amortised their capital cost. And so electricity authorities that don't have a green bone in their body but can read a balance sheet are closing their old coal-fired power stations because the renewables are cheaper. And that's why the government indecision simply beggars belief that 10 years ago there was an economic price to pay for closing coal and replacing it with solar and wind. But the CSIRO annual Gen Cost study shows that solar and wind with enough storage to be firm capacity is much cheaper than coal or gas. So it doesn't even make economic sense.
Well, the market is leading, isn't it?
It is, that's right. And you have the extraordinary thing that the Business Council is urging the government, the Minerals Council, the National Farmers Federation, and you have a few National Party MPs, some of whom clearly still don't believe the science, or are pandering to some fossil fuel interests that are holding back the nation.
What are you hopeful about, Professor?
Well, I hope that the old adage is when the people lead, the leaders eventually follow. And I made the point the other day that the loss of Warringah to Zali Steggall should have sent a shiver down the spine of these members of parliament that are holding back progress, because what that shows is that even a blue ribbon seat is vulnerable if the member of parliament is seen to be so hostile to the community mood, which is overwhelmingly that climate change is a serious issue and we need to respond to it. And given that there's now, no economic cost, the survey that the Advertiser published this week showed that people believe that rapidly moving to renewables will be better for them economically, will be better for their household budget, will be better for their kids' chance of jobs, and I think they're right on all those counts.
Emeritus Professor Ian Lowe, thank you very much for joining us, and his book is Long Half-Life, The Nuclear Industry in Australia. Thank you very much, Professor.
It's been a pleasure talking to you, Peter.
Coming up